wherever you are. We all want that. We all need that.
So my question is that could you share me a bit about the question, about the topic of the influence without authorities? Because, in the organization hierarchy, it's very difficult to do it. So could you do some explanation about that? And if possible, could you share some of your personal tips about how to do it in an organization? As a CEO or as a position?
Well, maybe, and I'll get you may shut me off if I talk for too long here, but because it's another great question you're putting on the table. It used to be the case, I would argue, epitomized by Jack Welch at GE, of the kind of what you do is you align an organization, you communicate, you incentivize, and then they go. My image is kind of it's like a cowboy on a horse with a white hat that says, go this way, and all the horses go, that's the old image of CEO leadership. And I think there's no way that can work today, and I'll tell you why. One is that the issues are so complex and happening so quickly that one brain, one leader cannot handle all the issues that are going on. It is an impossibility because the world's way more complex. So therefore, an effective leader has to build a leadership team. In my view, you need to at least have 6 to 8 people to be able to get things done and handle the chop and the opportunities and the restructuring that goes on. That's part of, so you have to build a team. And you don't build a team by telling people what to do. You motivate them by having a purpose that gets everyone excited about where they're going. People like to have an ambitious challenge, especially in a leadership team, that gets people energized. People like to think that it isn't just their small area that they're responsible for, they have a broader set of responsibilities. They may have a specialization, but it's T-shaped. You may be the finance person, but doesn't mean you don't think about the whole company. And so as a leader, you need to be thinking about the purpose, how you're going to get everyone together to be excited about what they do, to delegate, so you're not second questioning someone. If you think you know everything, that's the fastest way to shut people down, because they say, why should I say anything because this person thinks they know everything? So that's why I think what I said, influence without authority, is how you're building a team, you're enabling more people to do more. The more people do, the less you have to do, but that means you have to let go. So for control freaks, it's going to be a problem. You will not be able to lead very well if you're a control freak in where it is because of what's happening. On a personal level, I'd say the following. In McKinsey, this may be an unfair example, most people join because they don't want to be told what to do. One of the reasons I joined McKinsey is because I didn't want anyone telling me what to do. I value my independence. So I learned, but if I went to Arthur and said, Arthur, you must do the following thing because I'm more senior than him, he might do it for 2 minutes and he's going to say, I'm out of here. This guy's a jerk. I don't need to work with him. I'm going to go somewhere else and I'm going to do something different. So what you find is when you work in teams, here's what I've learned right away is forget about hierarchy right away. Just go with the meritocracy. The best idea wins. Be blind to hierarchy. And you can do that. If you have that mindset, you're going to learn a lot more than you ever have imagined, because often the least experienced people have that. And one example I'll give you is Lou Gerstner, who many people may know or not know. I think he's one of the most successful CEOs ever. He's the guy who ran RJR Nabisco, he ran American Express, he did the turnaround of IBM, right, without knowing anything about computers. And what he would do is, for example, when there was a McKinsey team coming in, the people that he wanted to talk to was not the most senior McKinsey person, he wanted to talk to the most junior McKinsey person. And he would ask them, what's your impression of us? What did you guys decide not to tell me because you were nervous about telling me? He used to call it, what did you put on the cutting room floor? And watching him ask questions and be very interested in what people that only have 2 months experience, just barely out of school, and he'd be focused on what this very successful dominant leader writing notes. That was a huge influence to me. 'Cause at first I was going, who the hell cares what that person, what do they know? And he said, they know a lot. They know a lot more than you know. And so you should listen. And so by watching very successful leaders deal in non-hierarchical ways, that's how I learned to see things. Another one I'll just give you an example was I worked at a bank. It was called Korea Housing Bank, and it was the one of 3 of 50 or 35 banks that was not bankrupt after the financial crisis. And I remember, I'll never forget, the CEO who came in from outside to the institution. We were basically helping him pick his leadership team, and he picked a guy who hated him, who actually was fighting for his job to be the CEO. And I remember going to the CEO and going, you're crazy. This guy's why are you picking this person? He's gonna disrupt you. I mean, why would you do that? And maybe I don't understand how Korea works, but I wouldn't be doing that. And he said, I'm doing this because this person is really, really good at what they do. I need this person in the organization. And I'm willing to accept that he wanted my job back then. He thought he had a chance, but I want to build a relationship with him so that he trusts me. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to trust him. Because if I go and trust him without expecting anything, and I'm going to give him a role, it's going to work out. And by the way, if it doesn't, I'll deal with it. But I remember at the time being shocked. And sure enough, this person did phenomenally well and helped drive it. But again, it was not about that CEO. He was willing, for the broader sake of what was going on, to have this person work on the team. And that influenced the other members of the team. They said, wow, if that's how it's going to work here, I'm kind of excited in where it is. So for me, I could go on and on, but it's watching leaders who are very successful do things that you'd be surprised at, they're the opposite of controlling, enabling, selfless, and you see it. And they don't write about it, they don't blather about it, but it's leadership, because they know they have to get a lot of things done. And that to me is, the epitome of leadership. I could go on, because I think one other thing I would say, it's a whole other aspect, and I would ask some of the lecturers, I sometimes think some leaders stay too long. One of the saddest things is to see a very successful leader and then they don't know when to get out. And that's a challenge, right? And I've had to have some of those conversations with some CEOs I work with that are very good friends and say, you know what, it's time to go. And they don't like to hear that very much in what happens. And what I try and do there and say, do you want to be known in history over time as a very effective leader that helped a successor come into play? Or do you want to see about that person that got too carried away with themselves, had a great start, and then blew up? And unfortunately, a lot of leaders blow up because they stay too long. So knowing when to step back is a very important part, but it's a very difficult thing because we all have egos. We all think we're so important that if you're not around, it won't work very well. So these are some of the elements of leadership that I think we should spend time talking about. When is it time to go? How do you help coach and enable people to grow far faster than you did through the particular system? Who's your kitchen cabinet? Who do you listen to for advice? Is it your direct reports? Maybe it's a retired executive. Maybe it's a customer. You need to think about that. So anyhow, that's why I've got to shut up, because you can go on. But that's that's why I think that's such an important skill, because what I hope you get from this is you don't want to learn this through doing it, because often when you do, you wish you'd done it differently. So let's learn from the people who are here what they would have done differently. That's why I always ask that question. If you did your CEO career over again, what would you have done differently? What do you wish you'd learned? And it often is on that influence.
Are there other locations in Africa that you would recommend, and especially as students who are developing a deeper knowledge of China market and how we can utilize and maximize that knowledge in Africa?
I think there's a number of countries. Like, first I would say is Nigeria. It's the largest economy, 175 million people, lots of changes that are going on, lots of huge business opportunities in that market. Then I would go to Ethiopia, very large market. It'll be an agriculture, food powerhouse, as I mentioned. It does, as the point was made before, they do probably have more of a, it's not a democracy, it's more of a government that's more, I'd say, Singaporean in the style of how Singapore is a democracy, but it's more a government that's in there for a long period of time in where it is. I would then argue that I would probably next go to East Africa. I'd think about Kenya. Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, that's a very important part of the world. South Africa, that's there. Angola, this is the 7 I'm getting. Then I'd go to Morocco. Morocco, because it's an important bridge between Africa and Europe, and that's going to be a very important part of the future, because we're going to see, I think, a lot more people from Africa going into Europe, but they're going to go through a training. Morocco is very good at their vocational programs for manufacturing and building, so they grow talent that then is going into Spain, is going into France, going into Italy. So Morocco is going to be a strategically important part. So those would be 7, I think, is the places that I would, any one of those areas, I would spend time. There's uniquenesses to all of them, but I would definitely, if I were you, make sure you're able to do some sort of at least a trip, but also even some work if you can, just to get a sense of how that place works. Well, I'm an optimist, so by definition, I think the opportunity, I see a risk as an opportunity as opposed to a problem. But there clearly are, like I mentioned, the water shortage, food shortage, energy shortage, and then natural disasters. The number of natural disasters is going up. I was just speaking this morning with a fellow named Ed Bertinsky, who's going to be making a film called, I think it's Anthropocene. It's the new, they believe there's going to be a new epoch that the world's moving into because we're damaging the planet. And they're voting on this in South Africa as to whether we're in this new epoch. But it's one that's, we have to be very concerned, because it's about water and how we manage those resources. But I think, again, this is maybe my positive, optimistic spirit. I think humans rally around crisis, if you will, in terms of how we deal with it. What I worry about is, because that will cause volatility, it can also create opportunities for mistakes to be made inadvertently. And so what I worry about is not the fundamental risks, it's the vibrations around those volatility of the opportunities and risks that could create conflict, right? I worry about, by mistake, here, look at an example. Ethiopia and Egypt are going to have increasing tensions over time because of water. Ethiopia is where the Nile actually comes in. That's where a lot of the land for the agriculture is going to be. Egypt believes that they own the Nile. That's from ancient times. And so when you start seeing more and more water diverted and not going down through Egypt, you're going to get conflict. And the good news is we know about that now. So what are we doing to try and help make that work? I worry about water between China and Vietnam. The Mekong is, fueled with water. It has to come through China first. If China dams rivers, the Vietnamese will say, hey, you can't do that because that's our water. And Chinese will say, well, stop us. You're going to come in here and tell us to not build a dam. So that's obviously, we don't need that. We should figure out how to work that resource together. So first is just being aware of where they are, and then putting in place a mechanism to discuss and figure out how you can make it work. And you look at Malaysia and Singapore, they've actually figured out how to deal with the water issue. Those two countries have had real tensions in the past, right? Malaysia at times would sort of say, we're going to cut the water off. And that, if you're on an island, it makes you nervous. But they've figured out ways to work it. So lots of risks. I don't want to say I hope you don't come away with the impression there's not a lot of risks. There are. But I think if we're aware of them and we kind of look at the opportunity that we can all have by dealing with them, then we can get to a solution.
What is your impression about the implications on companies and individuals who fail to live up to these extremely high standards? If we assume that success becomes more easily scalable with time, might we see a relatively small group of winners and a relatively large group of losers?
It's a great point, and I think one of the risks with this digitization, and the technology shifts in particular, is we are having more income inequality. There's no doubt about that in my mind, that we are seeing a small number of very large institutions, especially in the digital side. Google is very dominant in what they do, at least in the markets that they're operating in. Uber has become, so it isn't 3 or 4 companies, it's one company that you're starting to see, and that's the advent of technology. And I think, and what I worry about in particular is you're seeing very few people get very rich, if you will, and then what happens with the other people as we move through it? And this is where I think our education system is going to have to change. Our tax system is going to have to change in terms of how we think about spreading that wealth over time. It may seem like a strange thing for a hardcore market capitalist to say, but I think we have to think about that stuff, or we won't have stability. And so this rising income inequality is something that worries me, and you guys in particular are going to have to deal with it. That's why we do this work on long-term capitalism, inclusive capitalism, because if everyone doesn't have the same opportunity, which I think will be harder over time because of technology and knowledge, that's going to create a lot of tension. And if you look in our history, when the system becomes too unequal or doesn't work, you usually get some sort of a revolution. It's a bloody restructuring as opposed to a nice smooth one. So I think we all have to think about how we're going to deal with this. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better because of the speed with which it's moving. As humans, we had 50 years to deal with agriculture to the Industrial Revolution. We've probably got 5 years. So it wasn't the next generation, your kids it's you who has to retrain. And that's why I think that the speed and the scale of it happening means we're all going to have to take responsibility for it, because the system won't stay stable. So I don't know if it's actually something I worry about. I think a lot of the solution lies in education, but also tax policy.